Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's conversation on mocking versus mimicking data with the founders of Mockaroo and Tonic. My name is Chiara Colombi. I'm on the marketing team at Tonic, and I'm happy to introduce you to our speakers today. We have Mark Briccato, the CEO and founder of Mockaroo, and we have Adam Kamor, the co-founder and head of engineering at Tonic. They're each going to take some time to introduce their platforms, talk about key use cases, and also highlight some of the latest features that they've released. And then we're going to turn the floor over to all of you, as we always do. We love hearing your questions. Last month's webinar, we got so many great questions that really actually helped us kind of think about our roadmap and the features that we want to be focusing on first. So feel free to drop those in the Q&A. You can drop them in the chat as well. Sometimes we might just chat on back to give you an answer right away. Sometimes we'll save the questions until the end of the presentations. Before I pass things over to Mark, I'd like to give you kind of a high-level overview of the difference between Mockaroo and Tonic and how that difference really defines the use case for each tool. So Mockaroo is a data generator that allows you to create mock data from scratch, which means it's very useful if you're building a brand new application and you don't have any data to work with. If you need to spin up massive data sets for load testing, or maybe you need to create realistic mock data sets for sales demos, as we've been talking about. Tonic, on the other hand, is a platform that enables you to mimic data in an existing environment. So production data, our use cases really include getting your production data out of your lower environments so you can better equip your developers with safe but still useful data, protecting sensitive data for compliance, data security, and risk mitigation, or maybe creating a very targeted subset of a massive data set for easier debugging and QA. Now that you got that bird's eye view, I will pass things over to Mark at Mockaroo.
Thank you, Chiara. Let's see. Okay, sharing screen coming up. Cool. All right, you see my slides, right, Chiara? Okay, cool. Some of you may know Mockaroo, some of you may not. If you don't, Mockaroo is a website or web app for generating realistic fake data and mock APIs. So what can you do with Mockaroo? You can generate a wide variety of fake data from many different domains and at large volumes. And you can also mock APIs so that if you're like a front-end developer or designer, and rather than wait and be blocked by your back-end team that's working on building the real APIs, you can just mock them using Mockaroo and then continue on your front-end work. And it's designed first and foremost to be really, really, really simple to use. In fact, you don't even need to sign up for an account or anything. You can literally just go to mockaroo.com and start generating data from the homepage there and use it totally anonymously, as probably 60–70% of the users do. And if you do need to scale up and generate large volumes of data, there are paid plans, but they're very affordable, and I'll go over the pricing in a bit. And Mockaroo is surprisingly powerful. And so it may seem like the first 5 minutes that you use it is that this really quick, easy tool, but it has a lot of really powerful capabilities to do some pretty sophisticated things, and I'll get into that in a bit. And it's also enterprise ready. So for folks that are security conscious or need to generate really large volumes of data, Mockaroo can be run on-prem for large enterprises. So if you go to mockaroo.com right now, this is the screen that you'll see. You basically use this to generate what's called a schema. So you design the type of data that you want to generate. And most people generate either CSV data, so rows and columns, or JSON, which can be nested. So generally, you go through the fields and you pick a data type for each field. You can add more fields, remove fields. When you click on data types, you'll get the data type selector, and there's a ton of different data types across a whole host of domains. So over 145 things from like healthcare, IT, location-based data, automotive, construction, e-commerce, personal social network type stuff, a huge volume of fake data that can be pulled from. Once you've set up all the fields, then you can click the preview button at the bottom and see a quick preview of the data that would be generated at larger scale if you choose to. And then once you're happy with the design, then you can click download data and download your full data set. So here are some of the basics. As I mentioned, a ton of data types, over 140, 10 different output formats, including CSV, JSON, Excel, SQL, and several others as well. And without paying anything, you can generate up to 1,000 records per file with no limit on the number of files. So you can generate quite a lot of data on the free tier. If you need to generate more, you can generate up to 100,000 records per file for $50 a year, so really cheap, or 10 million records per file for $500 per year. So that's the basics. But as I mentioned, there's quite a lot of powerful features to be discovered once you get more into Mockaroo. So one of them is the ability to create REST APIs, mock REST APIs. So the idea is you create a schema and then you return random data for your schema by creating a URL in this REST API. And you can compute responses based on query parameters and the request body as well. And you can make up to 1 million API calls a day for that same $50 a year plan, or 10 million API calls per day for the $500 plan. So let me talk a little bit about the inspiration behind Mockaroo. It started when I was a lead engineer at a software company responsible for developers and a team of 4 or 5 QA engineers as well. And this was a healthcare company with a pretty sophisticated domain. We were in laboratory testing and specimen collection. And so it was something that like junior QA engineers didn't really know the domain that well. And when they would test the system in these long, complex workflows, the test that they would hand type in wouldn't be that good. And so it made testing long workflows like kind of difficult. So I created Mockaroo as this tool for my internal team just to be able to put in more meaningful data and make the value of their testing just much better. So that's how it started internally. And then I just kind of had the idea to maybe if I put this up on the web, other people will find it interesting. And it turns out they did. So probably from the first week that I put Mockaroo up, I started getting users kind of out of nowhere that found it really useful for their own use cases. And so it stayed like that for a few months until there was a bit of an opportunity that knocked. So my wife and I were actually on our honeymoon at the time, and I got a call, even though I was overseas, from a VP at Salesforce. And they were working on a very important project, which turned out to be Salesforce Wave. They were building this new analytics platform, and they needed a way to be able to simulate trends. And it was a very important project for them. They had bought a Super Bowl ad, invested a ton of money, probably tons of developers. And so the idea was that by putting fake data that simulated trends into the system, they could then demo the system finding those trends. And they needed it at a scale that was much bigger than Mockaroo could handle at the time. I think at the time there was just the free tier and you could generate like 1,000 records at a time. They needed 100 million plus records. So I had some engineering work on my hands, very stressful, but also very interesting. Eventually, got it working and got the deal done. And that's really what turned Mockaroo into a product, because I started to see the potential for larger businesses to do more sophisticated things. So that was kind of the genesis of Mockaroo Enterprise and some more powerful features. So one of them is the ability to ensure data integrity. So if you're generating mock data that needs to relate to data that you already have, you can upload your existing data as CSV, as a data set into Mockaroo, and then reference that within your schemas. And then you can also generate fake data and then reference that in future schemas within Mockaroo, and I'll show you that at the end. You can also derive one field from another using formulas. So if you need to have this rule that, so let's say you have start times and end times, and the end time always has to be after the start time, you could do that with formulas. So you'd use the date time field for start time, and then end time you'd use a formula that's basically the start time plus a random number of minutes. That way it's always after the start time. You can also use formulas inline to tweak built-in data fields as needed. So let's say you have a field that's company name and you wanted to add Inc. on the end of it for some reason. You can do that with inline formulas. So it's a good way to kind of massage things that are built in that are like almost what you need, but they need some slight changing. As I mentioned before, you can also simulate trends in Mockaroo. And I'm always surprised by how many people use this because I think it's a pretty sophisticated feature. But if you use either the custom list data type, which is what you use to basically specify your own vocabulary of terms, or if you upload a data set and then use the data set column type, you can pick a custom distribution rather than like a random distribution. So you can express the distribution in rules to simulate a trend. So in this simple case, we're generating maybe favorite colors for men and women. And we could say that the men tend to prefer red, and green, whereas women tend to prefer blue and red for some reason. You can also shape numeric trends using the scenarios feature. So here's an example where, let's say we're modeling the changes in gasoline price through the different months of the year. So maybe more expensive in the winter and cheaper in the summer. Although CSV is probably the most popular data type downloaded from Mockaroo, almost half the users generate JSON. So it's a very powerful JSON tool, and it allows you to create arrays and nested objects, and basically anything you could want to model in JSON, you can do with Mockaroo as well. And you can also mock APIs. So after you've created your schemas, if you want to put an API in front of that schema to, let's say, drive data towards the front end that you're designing, you can do that as well. So here's an example where I've created a recipes schema, and now I have a URL /recipes.json that'll return 10 randomly generated recipes from that schema. And there's quite a bit more as well. So for example, there's automatic data integrity between many of the different fields, for example, location fields. You can share your work with teammates using the project feature. There's a very richly populated set of community forums. And there's an API that allows you to automate everything that you can do from the front end. Not to be confused with the mock API for actually mocking APIs, but this is like if you wanted to generate schemas entirely programmatically, you can do that via this API. And so I want to talk a little bit about Mockaroo Enterprise. Many users find that they like Mockaroo, but for reasons, mostly security reasons, they're not willing to use something that's on the internet to generate data for their system. And so you can use Mockaroo Enterprise installed on your on-prem to generate data in your private cloud or on premises, and do so without limits. So the other use cases for customers that just need to generate like unrealistically large volumes of data, terabytes of data, you can't do that with Mockaroo.com, but if you run it on your own cloud, you can scale up as needed. So Mockaroo Enterprise is basically a Docker image that you run in your own private cloud. So most people choose Amazon or Azure or Google Cloud. There's no limits on users or data or anything else. And there's just one flat price of $5,000 per year, and the whole company can use it to their heart's content. And it scales horizontally to generate massive data sets. So basically, as much compute power as you're willing to throw at it, you can get out really large data sets in very quick time. And it writes directly to Amazon S3. So that's a really convenient place to process really large amounts of data. You don't have to like download it onto a machine and then re-upload it. It can just write to an S3 drive for you. So I want to end with two new things that just went into Mockaroo since our last webinar. This one actually was a result of the last webinar. So there are quite a few people asking for streaming data in Mockaroo, basically being able to design a schema and then stream that data to like an Internet of Things style endpoint, MQTT. And so that's a new thing that just got launched last week. And then I've also just a few days ago put in a feature that's been requested for a long time, which is improving the way that you can generate data sets related by keys in Mockaroo. So I want to demo that really quickly. Okay, so here's a company's data set that I've designed. It has an ID, which is a GUID, a name, a country, and a city.
Sorry to interrupt. I think we can't see the right window.
We see your presentation.
Oh, it's just sharing the slides. Thank you for interrupting. Hold on. Let me make sure that it's sharing the whole screen here.
Hey, since we did interrupt, we have time for a quick question.
Yeah, sure.
Cool, awesome. Someone just asked the question, can it generate data based on XML schema XSD?
You can output to XML, but you have to design the fields within the system. It can't just like automatically look at your XML schema. And it's a pretty common question. The reason for that is the data types in Mockaroo are much richer than what you could describe in like a SQL table definition or an XML schema. These are down to like specific domains like company name and country and medical record types and stuff. So you really have to go and design it within the UI, but you can output to XML.
Awesome.
Are you seeing the Mockaroo UI? So this is a quick schema I whipped up with company data. So ID, name, country, and city. And I'm restricting the countries to a few that are relevant for my data set for whatever reason. And so let's say that what I do want to generate is companies and then employees for those companies. So the way that you do that in Mockaroo is you start with the primary key. Let's start with companies. And if you go and you do, instead of just clicking download data, which would download it locally, you can do create data set. And what this will do is it'll generate the number of records that you specify here and store it as a data set within Mockaroo that you can then reference later in your future schemas. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And it's going to go and generate the records and upload the file to S3. Okay, so now I have my data set. It'll show you a little sample of what's in there. And if you wanted to download it to CSV, you could do that. But now let's say I want to go and create an employees data set that references this primary key as a foreign key. So I'll go back to schemas and I'll create a new one. And we can keep most of the fields here, first name, last name, email, gender, et cetera. Let's just get rid of IP address and let's replace that with company ID. And so to reference that other data set, we choose the data set column type. And then we just need to select our data set there and then select which column we want to reference. So in this case, it's the ID. And then if we generate data based on that, then you can see it's pulling in those GUID company IDs. So it used to be that you had to generate that first data set, download it, and then re-upload it back into Mockaroo. And millions of people succeeded with that pattern, very hardy souls. But now you can just generate the data directly. And you can do it at full scale. So there used to be like a limit of something like 10,000 records that you could upload, even if you were a paying customer. Now the maximum number of records that you can generate in these related schemas is just based on your plan. So it can be very large and it's very fast. So that's the newest stuff in Mockaroo. And that's pretty much all I wanted to show, but I'm excited to hear people's feedback and suggestions at the end. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Adam.
All righty, thank you very much, Mark. Always great to see the latest and greatest in Mockaroo. And just to stress it again, Mark's MQTT feature was brought up at the last webinar. So if you have a new feature that you want Mark to do, bring it up at this webinar, and maybe you'll see it in the next. All right, let me share my screen, and then we'll get started. Excellent. All right, is everyone able to see my slide deck? Yeah, Kiara, I'm getting a thumbs up. Cool. All right. So hi, everyone. My name's Adam. I'm the head of engineering and also a co-founder at Tonic. So what is Tonic and how is it different than Mockaroo? Well, Tonic is the fake data company. Tonic's main use case is taking already existing production data sets, either in your applications database, in flat files, or in your data warehouse, and de-identifying that data. So it's devoid of any PII or PHI, and then being able to use the output of Tonic in your existing workflows. If you use Tonic properly, then the output data set that you get will have no PII or PHI, and you won't be able to tell it's actually fake. All of the columns that we've identified as sensitive that we transform, they're going to look and feel real. They'll look and feel just like that original data, but they'll all be synthetic. So, when you're dealing with, highly sensitive data sets, healthcare data, financial data, data in regards to children's education, right? There's a lot of regulations and rules around what can and cannot be done with that data. But when you de-identify it in the proper way, you're actually able to use that data with a lot less risk. So, Mockaroo is excellent if you have a schema and you need to fill that schema with data. For example, when you're testing out a new feature. Tonic is great for when you have an already existing data set that you want to de-identify so that you can use a de-identified data set in an existing workflow. So a really common bread and butter use case at Tonic is development and engineering teams needing better databases with which to test and develop the product, right? Like the production database is too sensitive. So a lot of companies will create their own development data sets that are typically not at the same complexity and size level as the production database. And because of that, you get a lot of bugs and there's a lot of issues. But with Tonic, you get all of that complexity and all of that scale, and it's all with de-identified data. So, in front of us on the left side of the screen, you can see some of our existing customers. You see that we really our customers kind of span across many different industries, healthcare, finance, education, even B2C customers like eBay. And they come in a variety of sizes. I think our smallest customer probably has 20 people, and our largest has many, many tens of thousands of employees. We're backed by a great group of investors, GGV, Bloomberg Beta, SVCI, and X Fund, to name a few. We've been around since 2018, and we're located, I think maybe a majority of the company is located between San Francisco and Atlanta. But since COVID, really, we've been hiring all over the country. Like I said, we're the fake data company, and our mission is to protect the privacy of individuals while enabling companies to get things done. So with all that being said, let's do a demo of the product. Excellent. And just to confirm, Kiara, are you able to see the Tonic application now? We're good? Okay, cool. All right, thank you. All right, so this is what it looks like when you first log into Tonic after you've connected to a database. So I've already connected to a database today for the sake of time. Let me show you what that experience is like quickly. So today we're going to be using a sales retail database. It's actually a Postgres database sitting in Amazon RDS, and it contains about 12 tables and maybe 100 or so columns in it. This is the source database. This is where the real production data sits. This UI that you're looking at here is basically the same as every SQL client on the planet, where you got to provide the connection information to connect to the database. The only difference in Tonic is that you also need to specify your output database. This is where the data is going to go once it's been de-identified. It's also going to be a Postgres database. And in this case, we're putting it in Amazon RDS as well, but we don't need to. In fact, many of our customers will connect Tonic from an on-prem database to a database in their cloud sitting on public infrastructure. That's a very common use case, actually. The only real requirement is that Tonic needs network access to both databases, which brings me to a good point. Many of our customers actually host Tonic on their own prem. It's a really easy installation. Tonic deploys via Docker containers, and typically our customers are up and running in maybe 20 or 30 minutes at most. But for those that don't need to be on-prem, we also host Tonic as well. So, this database is Postgres, but we actually support a lot of different databases. Let me show you a few of the ones we support. We support all of the popular SQL databases: Postgres, MySQL, SQL Server, Oracle, and DB2. We support a variety of data warehousing databases such as BigQuery, Snowflake, and Amazon Redshift support is coming soon. We also support Spark and Databricks. Spark and Databricks are really common for some of our customers with large amounts of data sitting on S3 or DBFS or Azure Data Store, etc. So with all that being said, let's get into the demo. So I've connected to my database. The first thing Tonic does is run a privacy scan. A privacy scan is a really important first step. Like I said, many of our customers come to us with very complex databases, and it can oftentimes be more than one database. These databases can have hundreds or thousands of tables and thousands or tens of thousands of columns. There isn't one person in your organization that likely knows where all of the PII or PHI exists. So a privacy scan is a really good way to kind of bootstrap you, to get you started, to kind of help you show, hey, this is where a lot of your sensitive information lies. Let's look at some of the results that we found so far. So the privacy scan picked up on some first names in the customers table. You can click on that magnifying glass, and these are actual values from the table in the source database. It did the same thing on last name, and it did the same thing on gender. All right, that's all great. So what is Tonic saying to do? Well, first, it recognizes the type of PII. And second, it's suggesting the transformation to apply. So we're going to use the name generator, the categorical generator, and again, the name generator. And we'll see exactly what that means in a second. Notice, though, that as I applied the generators, the rows disappeared from this list. That's because this is a list of your sensitive columns that have not yet been protected. As we apply generators, the columns become protected and aren't on this list anymore. You know what? Here I see a column, though. Okay, it's occupations. I wonder if that's actually sensitive. Let me ask someone else in my organization if that's actually something we need to be concerned about. Is this really sensitive for our use case? So I'm going to ask Craig, who's a member of my organization. And when Craig gets back to me, I'll know what to do with this column. So let's pretend for a second that Craig responded. I got my notification via email. And then I go in and say, you know what? Craig said this column isn't sensitive. So I'm going to actually remove it from the list. And by removing it, I'm basically saying, hey, Tonic, that's not a sensitive column. You were incorrect. Okay, great. So, and of course, as we're doing all this, we're also generating an audit trail to keep records of who changed what column and what transformation and when they did it, which is really useful depending on the exact industry that you're in. So let's go a level deeper now. I'm going to go over to the database view. In the database view, I actually get to see all of my tables and all of my columns all at once. So like I said, this is a relatively simple database or data set. It has, 10 or 12 tables, but most of our customers will have many hundreds of tables on the left-hand side. I can search through my tables here. I can also filter them, and I can also search through my columns on the right-hand side. So for example, if I type in first name, I'll get all my columns called first name. And I already applied a transformation to the customers.firstname column when I was in the Privacy Hub. But there's all these other first name columns as well. And this is red, by the way, because they're actually flagged as sensitive. This was done through our PII scan. So if I look at what we've done thus far, we see that, okay, on the left-hand side, it's the original names. On the right-hand side, it's the fake names. But there's one issue. I see Melissa appears twice on the left-hand side, but it's mapped to Stanford and Erica on the right-hand side. So depending on your exact use case, you might actually want the same input to always be mapped to the same fake output. It's especially important, for example, if you're treating name as a kind of like casual primary key between a bunch of different tables and perhaps even between different databases. So maybe you have some of your data sitting in Postgres for your application. You have a warehouse in Redshift and AWS, and you have additional flat files sitting in S3, right? You might want all of that data to still link up properly once it's been de-identified, or maybe your application won't run, so you won't be able to develop and test, right? Well, in order to ensure that the same input always goes to the same output, I'll turn on this feature known as consistency. And when I do that, you'll see that Melissa now gets mapped to Rosella in both cases of Melissa. And as long as you're using a consistent name generator, no matter what column, table, or database you're in, will ensure the same consistent mapping. So Melissa will always be mapped to the same Rosella. Let's do the same thing now for our other three first name columns. I'm just going to do a shift select to select them. And instead of having to individually go through each column and apply the name generator, I can actually just do it here. I'll put it on first, I'll make it consistent, and bam. So now I have in all my first name columns a name generator applied. Let's get rid of this search so I can go back to seeing all of my columns. I can also do some advanced filtering here if I need to. I can filter by data type. I can look at all columns that are sensitive and not yet protected, right? This is similar to my view on the privacy page, but these are all of the columns that have been flagged as sensitive that haven't yet been protected. We could kind of think of this as our to-do. This is our to-do list, right? These are the columns that we know to be sensitive that we haven't yet done anything about. So we wouldn't want to generate data until this list is empty, either because we've protected all of the columns or we've correctly identified certain columns as not being sensitive. For example, I might say that marital status isn't sensitive. So I'm going to remove it from my list. And now this is my new to-do list. But let's remove those filters for now. Great. So let's go one level deeper into the product. This is the 10,000-foot view. This shows us all of our tables, all of our columns. Let's dig into a single table. So this is the customer's table, and this is actually showing you a preview of the table as it exists in the source database. Columns that are yellow, or rather columns that have yellow headers, are columns that are already protected. We've applied transformations to these columns. We can see it on the left-hand side. Columns that aren't yellow are not yet protected. And if we had a column flagged as sensitive, for example, if I had kept marital status as a sensitive column, then its column header would be red to indicate that, hey, this is sensitive, you need to do something about it. So I'll keep it as sensitive for now, just for the purposes of the demo. So, one option would be, we could go through each of these columns and apply the necessary transformations to properly de-identify the data set. And when we're done, well, we would then repeat the process through all of our other tables, and then we can go click generate data. And when you generate data, it's going to actually begin the process of first erasing your output database, second, copying the schema from the source to the output, and third, copying over all the data. The data that doesn't have transformations applied to columns will be copied over as is. And the columns that have transformations will be copied over, based on the output of those transformations. I'm not going to do this now, but we can do it in a little bit and we'll see how it works. So let's go through a few of these columns. Well, first are emails, right? We have a few options for emails. The most straightforward is probably just to use our email generator. It comes with a variety of options, including consistency, which we already spoke about. But I also might want to give everyone the same mail domain. So mailcapture.tonic.ai, for example. What that's going to do is make every email address, A, it's going to randomize them, and B, it's going to give every email address the same domain. And a reason to do this would be, maybe you actually want to test that your email sending is working in your staging environment. Well, you need to send those emails to accounts that you actually control. So since, my company is called Tonic.ai, I can just make a subdomain called mail capture, and it'll send all emails to that subdomain so we can verify our email sending flows are working. So now we get to marital status, which was, initially flagged as a sensitive column. Well, I have a few options for marital status, but I know in this data that men are more likely to be separated than women, okay? If I want to replicate that relationship in my output database, I would apply a categorical generator to this column. A categorical generator is going to shuffle values around while maintaining frequency counts. I've already applied that same categorical generator to the gender column. I did that on the Privacy Hub when we first got started. So it's also a categorical generator. So essentially right now, both columns are having their values shuffled around independently of each other. But if I want to maintain the proper relationship between, your gender and your marital status, what I would do is I would link those columns together. When I link the columns together, I'm telling Tonic, hey, these columns are related to each other. Figure out how they're related and replicate that relationship. And that's what I just did. We might go a step further and say, hey, you know what? Occupation is actually kind of related to marital status and gender as well. So I can do the same thing on occupation. I can apply my categorical generator, which is going to shuffle the values around, and I can link it into my other linkage of marital status and gender. So now I'm getting accurate values for gender, marital status, and occupation that are very similar to my source database, meaning the probabilities of various triplets are preserved, but it's been de-identified. So let's move on. Number of children we'll skip over for now, even though we have a variety of options available on that column. For annual income, I'm going to apply a continuous generator. A continuous generator is going to look at the distribution of income values, and we are going to preserve that distribution in our output or synthetic database, but each value in a given row will be drawn at random from that distribution. So if you were to look at the aggregate properties of this column in the source and output databases, they'd be the same. Even the shape of the distribution would be the same. But for any given row, it's going to be a random value. But it turns out, of course, that your occupation affects your income, right? On average, let's find a good example. On average, a chemist is going to make more than a butler, for example. So if I want to preserve the relationship between occupation and income, what I would do is I would actually partition my income by occupation. And in doing so, I'm basically telling Tonic, create an income distribution for each individual occupation. And then when we generate new data, first go pick a new occupation for this person. And based off the new occupation, go sample from the correct annual income distribution. So now if I was to look at, for example, the average income per occupation in the source and output databases, they would be very similar as well. I can go even one step further, and I can say that my bill amount is positively correlated with income. Higher incomes lead to higher bills, right? If I want to preserve that positive correlation, I can link my income and bill amount, and I'll preserve that. So now I have actually a pretty complex model. I have three categorical variables: gender, marital status, and occupation. All of those are generated in tandem together. And then based off the occupation that's selected, I am sampling a correct income and bill amount that'll make sense for the given occupation. So, those are some of our more statistical complicated generators. We have a variety of generators. In fact, we have too many to name. So today, all I'm going to really point out is that our generators are smart. And they're smart in the sense that we're going to always make sure that the output database we generate for you preserves the schema of the source, Specifically, it'll also preserve your primary and foreign key relationships. So for example, when I go to number of children, that's an integer column. We know it's an integer because we put a little 1, 2, 3 icon there. As compared to marital status, where we put an ABC to indicate it's a varchar or a text field. So when I go to the number of children column, I only get generators that actually generate integer outputs. I'm not going to be able to, for example, put a random name in this column. It wouldn't let me, because when I go to write to the output database, it would fail. Whereas on my text column, I'll have additional options available to me that are going to allow for text output that otherwise wouldn't be allowed. So going a step further, I can go over to my customer key column. This is actually a primary key of the database. When I look at what the options available to me are, I only get an integer key generator as a possibility. This is a special generator that works on integer primary key values. It guarantees uniqueness. So if you have primary keys that you consider to be sensitive, we can generate for you a new secure set of primary keys that guarantee uniqueness, and Tonic will automatically apply the same generator to all foreign keyed columns in your database that reference the customer key, such that we don't break your referential integrity. So let's say, for example, the 20 gets mapped to a 50, right? Well, in all of your foreign key columns that reference customer key, we need to provide that same mapping so that we don't break referential integrity. That is your foreign key references when we go to generate data. Now, some of our customers, though, don't actually have all of their foreign keys specified in the database. And that's no problem, because in this view right here, you can actually see all of the foreign keys that exist in the database. And if you have foreign keys that exist in your application, but not in your database, you can add them optionally over here. So in this UI, you can actually tell Tonic about additional foreign keys, and we'll treat them as if they were foreign keys that were in your database system itself. It's useful for when you're applying generators and you need to preserve certain types of logic, but it can also be useful for subsetting. So subsetting is another awesome feature in Tonic that allows you, on top of the de-identification you're doing, to also generate a database which is smaller in size. A lot of our customers come to us with databases that are hundreds or thousands of gigabytes in size. And in their dev and staging environments, they don't need that much data. Or maybe they're trying to make local development databases, right? This would be a database that runs inside a Docker container on your developer's laptop, right? You can't put a 1 terabyte database into a Docker container and run it from your laptop. Or maybe you could if your laptop is really big, but why would you want to do that, right? So with subsetting, we'll actually generate a smaller version of your database that statistically is valid, meaning it has the same representations between columns and the same relationships, and it still maintains referential integrity. So I can get started with subsetting by first enabling it, and then picking some target tables to subset based off of. And of course, any data that I subset will be transformed or de-identified according to the generators I selected on the previous pages, right? So I'll pick a really simple subsetting config just to kind of demonstrate what it's going to look like. So essentially, you have to target a table. I'm going to target the customer's table. I can either target a random percentage of it, like 10%, or I could do, where first name, like, Adam, right? So if I go with this clause, it essentially would target me just to customers that satisfy that constraint. Or maybe something that would make a little more sense would be state in, Georgia or California. Maybe that's a better example, right? So what's going to happen is we're going to sample from the customer's table all rows that satisfy that where clause. And then we are going to comb through all of the other tables in the database and opportunistically remove rows from those tables such that we don't break referential integrity. So you'll end up with a smaller database that's also been de-identified according to the rules that we selected earlier. And there's a lot more in subsetting. There's a lot of options and a lot of nuance to it, but we're not going to get into that today. But of course, happy to answer any questions about it that come up later. Excellent. So right now, I'm going to actually disable subsetting. I'm going to go back to the database view and let's generate some data, right? We've applied some de-identification rules to the customers table. We could go through all the other tables and do the same thing. But for now, let's just run a job. So we can see how the job's going. It actually is moving along really quickly. The first thing it does is it tears down the output database. It then copies the schema from the source to the output so that the source and output databases have identical schemas. And then it begins copying the data over. And this job finished. And this is a smaller database, so it finishes in a few seconds. But now, as a developer in your organization, you can directly connect your application to the output database and immediately get started working with de-identified data. So, in terms of our data transformation abilities, I think I've given you guys a good high-level overview. I'll point out one or two other things that might be useful for some of the folks in the audience that work for larger organizations. In addition to the commenting, which I showed earlier when we were on the privacy page, we also have other enterprise type features that allow for sharing and collaboration. So for example, Tonic supports SSO. And once you log in with SSO, you have the ability to share workspaces with other people in your SSO group or just in your organization, right? And when you share, you can assign, various privilege levels to the people that you're sharing with. So I think, we have a few that we ship with out of the box. There's viewer, auditor, and editor. Viewers and auditors can mostly just observe a workspace. I think auditors are allowed to leave comments. So for example, a typical auditor might be someone in your security org that needs to verify what you're actually de-identifying is conforming to all of the rules that the security org has. And then an editor is someone that has, nearly identical permissions to the person that created the workspace in the first place. Great. Okay, so let's close that now. And you know what? There's a lot more to the product, but I think for the purposes today, I'm probably already over time, to be honest. So I think I'm going to cut the demo off here. But if anyone has additional questions, I'd be happy to answer them once we move to the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Mark, as well. Great presentations. We do have a bunch of questions, so I'm going to hop on over into them. I'll start with a question for Mark, since those came in earlier. Mark, do you have some public schemas or shared schemas? For example, a Salesforce table load?
That may be my next feature. That is a long requested thing, and I'd love to do some community stuff around that to get people to be able to share their own schemas, since they're, it's all fake data anyway. I don't have anything off the shelf that I can give you, but I think that might be my next thing. So thank you.
Okay. Adam, there was a question when you were showing consistency. Ashley mentioned, that it would be incredibly helpful to be able to have consistency based on another key value. For example, if person ID is 123, we'd want Kelly to always go to Betsy, but a different Kelly, ID 456, would go to a different random first name. I knew there was a better answer that you could provide, so I didn't.
Yeah, so I have shared my screen again. Is everyone able to see it?
Mm-hmm.
Great. So when you turn consistency on, you actually get an additional drop down here. Consistency can be based on values in other columns, which I believe is what Ashley is getting at. So for example, instead of being consistent to the first name column, I could actually make it consistent to the customer key. So now let's say customer key is a column that appears in many different tables. You can always be consistent on customer key to ensure that, whenever you come across customer key 19, we'll generate Sybil as our, fake or synthetic name.
Great, thank you. So another question for Mark. Do you have any integrations with Snowflake?
Oh, no, I don't, but I'll use them a bit in another capacity. So that's a good one to look into, but no, not at the moment.
Yeah, I might as well share that question with Adam as well.
We don't have a connector to Snowflake at the moment. With that being said, every single database that was listed in the dropdown that I showed was added and supported by Tonic because a customer or a prospective customer asked for it. So if Snowflake is what you need, come start a conversation with us after this call, and we can talk about it.
There was actually another question about a database, whether we supported it, Vertica. If you could.
Oh, Vertica. That I think we don't support that at the moment. I don't know a lot about Vertica, but we have heard it come up before. I'm not sure who asked that question. Whoever's asking about Vertica, you're absolutely welcome to email me, and we can kind of chat about it for a minute. Or Kiara, what's the best way for attendees to reach out to us after the webinar?
You can email hello@tonic.ai.
Great. Yeah, do that. Mention Vertica. and then we can look at it. Happy to discuss.
Yeah, actually, I will go ahead and share contact information now.
Yeah, let's keep that up.
All right, another question for Mockaroo. A feature request, actually. Someone said the coolest thing would be the ability or workflow to import an XSV or CSV and have it profile the fields, then allow me to set the data types. I believe they're talking about scenarios where they export an existing table in Salesforce but need to populate it with data.
Yeah, and that kind of speaks to the big difference right now between Mockaroo and Tonic. That's like Tonic's wheelhouse is taking data that you have and then de-identifying it or generating fake data based on that. Mockaroo doesn't do that yet, but it's a great suggestion because I certainly see through Tonic's demos how useful that is.
Yeah.
But thank you.
All right, a question for Tonic. Let's see. Are there any other schema agnostic or NoSQL sorts of database backend integrations being planned for Tonic?
So at the moment, we support Mongo. I think I forgot to mention that during the demo, but I believe it appears in the dropdown. So at the moment, we support Mongo. We're certainly open to supporting additional NoSQL databases. It's just if we haven't at this point, it's simply because we haven't had a customer that's needed it. So definitely reach out if the NoSQL database you're talking about is not Mongo. If it is, then we already support it. We also do support, things like, flat files that are typically semi-structured like JSON via our various Spark offerings.
All right, I think, oh yeah, this might be another feature request for Mockaroo. Salesforce NPSP schema would be a nice to have.
Okay, I'll note that. I don't know what that is, but I'll look into it.
Okay. And a question for Tonic. Does Tonic store any source data within the product? How does that work? Because we see, the
Of course. So no, we don't store source data within the products. But also, that question is normally asked for customers that are using our hosted offering. Most of our customers, I'd say a big majority, actually run Tonic on their own prem. So they're running Tonic themselves. And in fact, Tonic runs by default on machines that are air-gapped, meaning machines that don't have internet access. So when you run Tonic on-prem, it's entirely running on your hardware. The data never leaves your VPC, and there's never phone homes to Tonic, at least by default. But the shorter answer is no, we don't store data in our product.
Okay. I think there's also some discussion around taking smaller data sets and making them larger. And I think that's something both Mockaroo and Tonic could help with.
Right. Yeah, Mark, do you want to answer first?
I think your answer is probably better than mine. But the one thing Mockaroo has going for it there is it can generate very massive amounts of data, terabytes and terabytes if you need. But it doesn't consume an existing data set and then extrapolate from that. Although I think that'd be a pretty popular feature, but that's exactly what Tonic does. So I'll turn it over to you.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Mark. I'll share my screen briefly just to kind of demonstrate how that works in Tonic. Oh, thanks, Kiara. Share. Cool. So I'm back on the page we were on earlier on the customers table where we were adding transformations. Right now, and I didn't go over this in the demo just for the sake of time, but right now we're in masked mode. Masked mode means for every row in the source table, we're actually going to write a single row to the output table. So if your source table has 5,000 rows, your output table is also going to have 5,000 rows. But we have other modes that Tonic can operate in. Synthesized mode is a good example. In synthesized mode, you actually control the number of rows we output. So I think this table actually has, 2,000 rows in it. I think that's right. But I can actually control what it is. I can make it 10 rows. I can make it 100 rows, 1,000, or, I don't know how big that is, but that's a very big number, right? The requirement though, when you use synthesized mode is that because, we don't have underlying data to work with, or rather we don't have enough underlying data to work with, you actually are required to apply a transformation to every column. So here we've already applied transformations to these columns during the demo. But for example, when I scroll over, we never applied a transformation to number of children. So if we were to synthesize, Tonic wouldn't know what to do with this column. Well, if you don't care about it, you could use like a null generator and just put nulls in there. But assuming we did care about, maybe we'd want to go with the suggestion of a random integer and maybe make it between 0 and 5, for example, right? And of course, we'd have to do the same thing through all of our other columns. So for store membership, maybe I'd go with the categorical so it looks real, right? For birth date, customer, since, and last transaction, those are date columns. And Tonic, and I didn't demo this, and I'm not going to now, but Tonic has like very sophisticated mechanisms for generating dates that look very real. So for example, we can generate new birth date, customer, since, and last transaction dates that'll look good on a given row, but we'll also preserve the various like statistical properties of each column in the output data set. And we would likely want to do that during while we're in synthesized mode.
Right, I'm going to pass things back to Mark again with a question for Mockaroo. Do you have any recommendations for profiling tools for gathering the data, the distribution of data to generate new data?
Interesting. What came to mind actually, I don't know, maybe this is a shameless self-promotion here, but I did just launch a new tool that is a data science tool for developers called flatbase.io. And if you've been around on Mockaroo for a while, you've probably seen the banner there. That's a really helpful way if you just got like some data sets laying around in CSV and you want to throw them into a database, but you don't want to create a database, just upload it online and then start querying and charting. So I actually use that quite a lot in other capacities just to like analyze random pieces of data without the investment of creating a database. So I hope you find that useful, flatbase.io.
And a question for Tonic. How about an integration with Elasticsearch?
Interesting. So we, I don't know a lot about Elasticsearch, but I believe when you upload documents to Elasticsearch, it's typically done as JSON files or JSON documents. You can operate on flat files containing JSON today via our Databricks and Spark offerings. So, one possibility would be to export data from Elasticsearch, operate on it via Tonic, and then re-import it into Elasticsearch. But in terms of like an actual direct connector into Elasticsearch, that's not something we support currently. But again, you're welcome to reach out at hello@tonic.ai.
That's a reminder for me to share our contact information again. All right. For Mockaroo, is there a limit to the number of schemas I can create on the non-enterprise tiers?
No, not even on the free tier. There's no limit on schemas or number of data sets or number of anything that you could upload or create. Just the number of rows in a file and the number of API calls in a day are the two things that are limited by price.
Great. And for Tonic, how does Tonic handle messy or broken data?
Hard to answer that without knowing exactly what you mean. But in general, Tonic's goal is to preserve all of the properties of your production database and replicate that in a different database that you can put in your dev or staging or local environments, right? So if you have oddities in your source database, a lot of our customers want those oddities to exist in the output because that's what's in production and that's what they need to be testing and working against. Now, if you mean just truly broken, for whatever reason, you really just don't want it in your output. And I struggle to think of like what the use case there would be, but perhaps you have one. We do have generators that can kind of examine data on like a per value at the per value like level and conditionally apply certain generators in various cases. And that might not make a super amount of sense the way I'm describing it. But think of it as like being able to conditionally apply generators on a given column as opposed to always applying that generator. And this is like a really nice building block for composing more complex logic for how to transform given columns. And we have customers using generators like that for kind of, cleaning things up at the moment. But it's not like, it's definitely not like a primary focus of Tonic, I would say, even though it is doable.
That's actually a pretty relevant question for Mockaroo. Like one of the use cases there is somebody might be building the part of their system that ingests data from customers. And so they actually want to simulate some of the mess that they're likely to encounter there. And so with Mockaroo, the common way to do that is with that inline formula. So like you might pick a built-in data type like gender, and then every 100 or so rows use an inline formula to just throw in some chaos and see if it breaks the system. So that's actually a popular use case. Mockaroo is often used for testing.
Yeah, that's great. I was going to say there's another question for Mockaroo, but I have one for Tonic here. What if I have data text var in other languages?
Sure. So Tonic supports all UTF-8s. We're going to work with the character set that your database is set to. But perhaps you mean also for what if you have a column of names, but those names aren't, Anglo-centric? Because, the names that Tonic generated were Anglo-centric. The way Tonic generates names is just with a list of names that we ship with the product. We can ship other lists for you if you need. Additionally, we have generators that allow you to provide your own custom lists that we can also sample from. We have customers in many different countries and locales, and that's typically how they accomplish what they need to. But yeah, that's it.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? We do have one to Adam. As you do a origin database data to output database data, say RDS1 to RDS2, does Tonic have good protections to protect original data being faked and remove all original data completely behind the scene in the end?
So that's a very good question. I think what is being asked is, how do we know that the output of Tonic is actually secure, right? Like, how do we know that we've actually properly de-identified everything? Well, there's a few ways, right? And it can be tricky. One, you need to keep really good track of what is considered PII and PHI in your database, via the privacy hub and manually marking things as sensitive and not sensitive, right? Tonic can be configured, for example, to not generate data when new columns have been added, or when a column that's sensitive hasn't yet been protected, right? A really common thing to happen is you've set up all your transformations, everything's secure. You go to generate, but unbeknownst to you, someone has recently added a new column to a certain table that contains people's birth dates or their SSNs or the zip code in which they live. And you didn't know about it, so you hadn't yet transformed it. Tonic can be configured to not generate data in that case, to essentially alert you to the fact that a new column has been added, and you can't generate until you acknowledge the alert. Another thing that might be of interest is that we're currently working on what we're calling privacy reports. So these are reports that are going to give you an idea of how de-identified from a mathematical point of view your data is after being run through Tonic. And that's not available yet, so I'm not able to demo it, but it's coming soon.
Like I said, your questions are fueling our roadmap. So
yeah, that's right.
If any other last questions, we're basically over the hour now, but we're happy to stick around a little bit more if there's more questions to be asked. Oh, I do have one more question. Does Tonic have the ability to do value-based randomization instead of column randomization?
So I'm going to have to kind of take a guess as to what that means. I think value-based randomization would be given a value, randomize it, like perturb it based on that value, as opposed to like just maintaining aggregate statistics on the column. I think that's probably what they're getting at. We have certain generators that'll operate based on the value as opposed to on the aggregate statistics of a column. It just depends on what the exact use case is. With that being said, we're constantly developing new generators for customers, like based off the roadmap. It's not uncommon for customers to request a generator and for it to be available 2 or 3 days later, depending on exactly what the details of it are. But it's also likely that we have what you need out of the box in that regard.
Okay, now there is one more question. Do you see that, Adam?
Yes. Okay. So I think what was meant by value randomization is conditionally, modify certain values and not others. Yes, we do have that ability. We have conditional generators, which allow you to, either yes or no, operate on a given value based off conditions and predicates that you can establish in the product. So yes, we support that.
Great. Glad to get that wrapped up before the end. Again, please feel free to reach out to us by email. We're on Twitter. You can find at Mockaroo Dev or at Tonic Fake Data. We'd love to hear from you guys. If you've got any other follow-up questions that you think of after the event. Also, there were a couple questions. The event is recorded, so I will be sending out a link to the recording either this afternoon or tomorrow. Thank you all again for joining us, and thank you so much, Mark and Adam, for the presentations.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.